Hello, everybody. This is sort of a bait and switch here. I think your agenda just says ethics, a new ethics code or something like that, and I'm actually not going to talk about that. But so instead, what I wanted to talk about was I found a very interesting article by a guy named Gregory Moffat. It was in Counseling Today, and it's an article about ethics, religion, and diversity, and specifically the part of it that I want to talk about is the ethics of working with LGBTQ community. And let me explain why I thought this was important. So there's a potential problem here for working with that community. What happens is sometimes apparently is counselors will refer LGBTQ clients to other counselors with the rationale that they're not trained to work with such clients on related issues. So they kind of hide behind that, but oftentimes what actually is happening is they really refer out to other people due to strongly held religious beliefs against such relationships and behavior. But they don't want to come out and say, I don't want to treat you because I don't agree with your lifestyle. Instead they say, well, I'm not really qualified to work on this sort of a thing, and so ethically they will hide behind the ethic of saying, since I'm not qualified, I will refer you out. The problem with that, however, is that, well, before I get to that part, so one of the things I wanted to figure out is, does this really happen? And Ford and Hendrick, back in 2003, found that psychologists and marriage and family counselors did actually refer LGBTQ clients out inappropriately because they just felt it was against their views. And there's a whole bunch of folks that have done research on some therapists view homosexuality as a disorder. Pardon this. I generally hate reading PowerPoint slides, but this subject kind of requires it. So some therapists view homosexuality as a disorder and attribute all presenting concerns to sexual orientation, lack of knowledge and awareness about possible consequences of coming out. They use a heterosexual frame of reference for same-sex relationships. They display heterosexual bias and express demeaning beliefs about homosexuality. So it can be a problem. And part of the reason I was kind of fascinated about this is we're in rural, deep East Texas, which is a very conservative bastion. Churches on every single corner. And that sort of conservative view can run into problems, especially with the LGBTQ community. And so if that's what's happening, this is a problem. So we do know that LGBTQ clients utilize mental health services at a much higher rate than heterosexuals. So let me ask you, why do you think that's true? Because it's very well documented. They use a higher... I need to speak louder. So why do you think the LGBTQ community uses mental health services at a higher rate than their heterosexual peers? What might make that community need more mental health services, do you think? Well, they use it more. So why do you think maybe they use it more? Bullying is one thing, yeah. What else? Lack of family support. What was another one? Suicide risk, sure, which could possibly be the result of bullying or lack of family support, stuff like that. A lot of times people from minorities tend to be oppressed by the dominant society, the dominant heterosexual society in this case. And if people are oppressed, they're going to likely have some psychological difficulties on top of that, and so in turns they go to counselors. And if they're going to counselors that have a bias against their being LGBTQ, that can be a real problem for them getting proper services. So I did some looking into client experiences. So from the other side of it, what kind of experiences do clients have when they go and see counselors? And Graham, Carney, and Cluck reported that LGB clients tend to screen counselors for their attitudes towards sexual orientation. So they will look at counselors and try to figure out, is this somebody who's going to be accepting of my sexual orientation? They found that counselor training programs tend to include LGB information in a generalist multicultural class rather than talking about it in a more specific, in-depth sort of way. And so they get some of it, but they get it along with a bunch of other multicultural stuff. And trainees have said that's not particularly helpful, that they need more training, specific training on that. So because they rate their skills with that clientele is lower than their awareness and lower than their knowledge. So in rank order. So they think their awareness they think is pretty high, their knowledge is fairly high, but their actual skills in working with that population they don't rate particularly high, like medium. So higher competency is associated with specific training for those particular kinds of clients, LGBTQ clients. So it behooves us as professionals, if we're going to have clients who have problems related to sexual orientation, that we get training on how to work with those clients regarding their particular issues. And so at the end of this PowerPoint, I've got some competencies for that. Another study found that lesbians with disabilities were dissatisfied with their counselors due to their lack of awareness and education regarding sexual orientation. They found for them to find counselors who got it, who understood, both for disability and for sexual orientation, was especially difficult. So just finding a counselor that can deal with disability issues is one thing, and then if you had LGBTQ issues on top of that, is even especially more difficult. And participants had to negotiate whether they were going to self-disclose to their counselors about their sexual orientation, which puts an extra burden on the client before they can even begin to start trusting their counselor. And so I think you can easily see, if I can't trust my counselor regarding something basic to my life, it's going to be difficult for me to really work particularly well with that counselor. And then another study is that they found some helpful things from therapists and counselors. Obviously, the positive therapeutic relationship, the basic skills are always very, very important. They want counselors that are knowledgeable, helpful, and affirming of sexual orientation or gender identity. They want counselors who can provide support for client choices regarding coming out, and they don't want to be pressed about discussing sexual orientation if it's irrelevant to the problem. Not everything has to do, not all problems are necessarily related to sexual orientation. Some unhelpful things is they run into counselors that have lack of LGBT competence. They run into counselors who impose values, judge, or invalidate or misunderstand their orientation. And sometimes they fail to make a connection with, counselors fail to make a connection with those clientele, and they tend to focus on assessment and diagnosis rather than what the person actually needs. You know, diagnosis can be important, but it's also this label, and it's not, clients aren't particularly interested in all of that a lot of times. They just want somebody to come and listen to them and try and understand them, not to assess and diagnose them all the time. So the ethics code requires, the ACA Code of Ethics and the CRC Code of Ethics, they both say that you can't discriminate. Rehabilitation counselors do not condone or engage in prejudicial treatment of an individual. That's just the basic thing there. And avoiding value imposition. Rehabilitation counselors are aware of and avoid imposing their own values, attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. Respect the diversity of clients and seek training, that's the key word there, in areas that they are at risk of imposing their values onto clients, especially when the values are inconsistent with the client's goals or are discriminatory in nature. So ethically, you can't be referring people out just because you don't feel like you have the expertise. You need to go find the expertise. You need to go seek out that training so that you can go work with those clients. Rehabilitation counselors refrain from referring prospective and current clients based solely on the rehabilitation counselor's personally held values, attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. So it says right there in the ethics code, you're not supposed to be referring out just because you're uncomfortable with somebody's sexual orientation. People hide behind the part of the ethics where they say, well, if I don't have the skills or the expertise, I don't have to work with these people. But when you look at the ethics code as a whole, that's not the way it's supposed to work. I'm not going to read all of these. Professional competence, again, for the CRC. Practice only within the boundaries of their competence based on their education, training, supervised experience. Do not misrepresent their competence. Rehabilitation counselors transitioning into specialty areas requiring new core competencies begin practicing only after obtained the consultation, education, training, and experience. Rehabilitation counselors recognize the need for continuing education to acquire and maintain a reasonable level of awareness of current scientific and professional information. So basically, again, same point, that we as rehabilitation counselors or licensed professional counselors are required to go get the training in order to work with that clientele. Yeah. Yes. Yes. No, you're not. But when you look at it as a whole, so you can say, look, I don't have the training to do this, but you can't just use that as an excuse to not go out and get the training. See what I'm saying? And then you go get some competency. That's a really, really good question because there's not a lot of specific training necessarily out there. But you can go find other people who have the skills. So like one of our former students working as a counselor in our area, Lindsay Milner, is a real expert in this area. And so I would go and consult with somebody like her, to go find somebody who knows about these things and use her as a supervisor to help me better understand so that I could go and work with that clientele. So you kind of have to go find resources in order to be able to do that. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And if I was in a position like that working for an agency and something like this came up and I had to go to the supervisor and I got any resistance, I would just whip out the ethics code and say, see, we need this training if we're going to work with these clientele and these particularly related problems. So I need we would have to ask our agency to provide some sort of resources and support so that we can go be more competent in problems related to that.
Okay, so then what do we show the supervisor that we don't have those capacities? How do we know that we're not qualified to do it? Oh, well, there you are. You're right.
It's not that much different, and looking through all the literature and all this stuff, it's not that much different from somebody who isn't trained to work with people with disabilities and disability-related issues going and trying to do it anyway. And then they...
But how does the individual gain that awareness unless somebody files a complaint against it and says, well, unless they just refer out, and they don't accept working with people for whatever reason?
I think counselors can fall into the trap of, I can work with this, I can work with anything and anybody, when they might be deceiving themselves into, I don't necessarily have the expertise. So it calls for some sort of self-reflection on my ability and knowledge to work with a set of clientele, in this case LGBTQ community, on that. So, you have to kind of make the assumption that I can get more training on something like this, rather than I can handle it, because that's the kind of thing that gets people in trouble, literally. Yeah. That's a really interesting, I don't know. That's a very interesting question. I'm not aware of anything like that. She asked if there was an assessment tool that an agency could use that would help somebody become aware of their lack of knowledge or lack of skill for that clientele. And I'm not aware of anything like that, but there might be. I didn't come across anything like that. Or they would take it on their own, I suppose. Yeah. Yeah. It depends upon your agency and the clientele that you're going to be working with in your agency. If you're going to come across this clientele on a regular kind of basis, I'm sure they would have some sort of training to kind of help people understand that. Part of it, too, is just go find the literature and read up on it. So Lindsay Milner, who I mentioned before, she gave me the article with all the competencies in it, and so that I have the competencies at the end here. We probably won't get to it. But you have to find out what you don't know. You can't just hide behind, oh, I'm okay, I got my degree, I got my CEUs, I'm good to go. You always have to be have some self-reflection about what else can I learn about various clientele. Yeah. One of my professors always gave me the model that I've always found very, very useful. And you need to think of your skills as a portfolio that you're always trying to fill. So don't focus so much on what you have. Focus on what else you can get, what gaps you may have. And this could be one of those gaps that you would need to think about it, though, rather than just make the assumption that I can work with these folks on issues that you may not understand. And so think of it as improving your counseling portfolio on different types of clients, just like you would working with people with different types of disabilities. If I'm going to work with people with MS, I'm going to go find a lot that I can about MS and the psychosocial issues related to MS, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In that sense, it's not that much difficult or different. And the ACA Ethics Code, it's right there in the mission, is to enhance the quality of life in society by promoting the development of counselors and advancing the profession to promote respect for human dignity and diversity. So in the ACA Code of Ethics, it's right there in the mission. And then in there's separate, like personal values, it says almost the same thing as the CRC Code, and values within termination and referral. Again, the verbiage is almost the same as the CRC Code. So again, ethically, in both the CRC and the LPC ACA Code of Ethics, it says that we need to go out and get this kind of training so that we can work with this clientele on these particular related issues and not just refer out because it makes us uncomfortable.
So if we see an organization characterize themselves as Christian counseling,
Mm-hmm.
then that might be an ethical issue.
Very possibly. Potentially, yes. Christian is a very broad term. There's a large spectrum that would fall under the umbrella of Christian, and on one end of that spectrum it might be a problem, and on another end of that spectrum it might not. And so just to label it that way may or may not be accurate. Yeah. However, on the conservative side, that may be a problem. Yeah. So there's a difference between religious and professional morality. So is it ever okay, this is my question to you, is it ever okay for a counselor to impose their worldview of moral behavior on a client? Everybody's just an automatic no on that? Are you sure? Are you really sure?
Okay, so what's
There's a difference between an evidence-based worldview and religious interpretation worldview. If I'm working with an addict, I can impose on that person that you should probably not be taking drugs. That's an evidence-based worldview because there's all sorts of bad consequences that come from you taking recreational drugs to excess. So we do sometimes impose a worldview on folks, but we do it from an evidence-based perspective. Yeah. Why? Right. There's a tension between respecting client autonomy, clients get to choose to do whatever they want, and at the same time, educating clients about the consequences of those actions so that they can make, quote unquote, the proper choice about that. Similar in the way that you would guide that client to make better choices? Yeah, yeah. But ultimately, you know, I worked with clients that made bad vocational choices, and I had to let clients make and learn from those bad choices, As long as safety wasn't going to be an issue, then it becomes a different sort of thing. But if safety is an issue, I may impose my worldview on that client, as in this is an unsafe behavior. But still, client autonomy, they get to do whatever it is they want to do. But I may try and impose my view about safety, etc. See that? So that's why it becomes, so sometimes we do impose a worldview. And also, there's a long history of using religion to oppress minorities that we as counselors are ethically bound to resist. I don't need to go into the history about all of that. I think it's fairly evident. So we need to be aware of that so that we're not hiding behind that and using that to oppress clients or ignore client problems based on our own religious views. We don't want to be, as counselors, ethically, we don't want to be oppressors for our clientele. And we need to be self-aware so that we're not acting in any way that might, in some way, oppress clientele. So there's some lawsuits related to all of this. This was interesting to me as an educator. So Julia Ward was dismissed from the counseling program at Eastern Michigan University because she refused to work with a client who engaged in homosexual behavior. And her argument was that having to work with a client that engaged in homosexual behavior violated her First Amendment right to free speech and the exercise of religion. So the counseling program said, no, you need to work with this clientele. She says, you can't make me. It violates my freedom of religion. And they went to court. The long end of it is that she settled out of court for $75,000. But afterwards, Michigan's legislature passed a Julia Ward Freedom of Conscience Act that forbids public colleges and universities from discriminating against or disciplining students participating in counseling, social work, and psych programs because the student refuses to counsel or serve a client as to goals, outcomes, or behaviors that conflict with their worldview. In Arizona and Nebraska have similar laws, and I think other states probably do too, but I kind of stopped searching at this point. So ethically, we need to work with these clientele, but the law will step in and say, no, you don't. So again, we have this tension between these two things. True and false. Counselors are free to think as they please, practice religion freely, and live their lives as they choose. True, right? But what counselors cannot do is make choices that are at odds with wanting to work as a counselor, such as simultaneously want to proselytize our clients into our personal belief system. So in your personal life, yes, that first statement is absolutely positively true. If it starts carrying over into your counseling professional behavior, then it can become a problem. And so one of the things that we have to train our students is to find a way to make some sort of a separation between your potentially conflict between your religious views versus your professional ethically bound behavior. And how to maybe either leave that at the door when you go to work as a counselor, or figure out some way to modify your belief system so that you're going to be able to be effective with behavior that you may not necessarily historically in your past have agreed with or thought was acceptable. And Moffat makes the interesting point here that it's not that different from trying to sell your clients a car or recruiting them to vote for your political candidate. We would never do that, and yet sometimes some counselors will, because they disagree with a person's behavior because of their religious views, try and change that person's orientation or judge that person's orientation as wrong, or invalidate that person's experience because they disagree with it. Conceptually, it's not that much different than saying, you need to vote for Trump because whatever. We would never do that, and yet sometimes because of religious morality, sometimes counselors might do that, and we shouldn't. So again, this is Moffat. He says, if you want to be a pastor, go ahead and be a pastor. If you want to go be a counselor, go ahead and be a counselor. You just can't mix the two. And faith-based counseling is a completely different matter. To kind of earlier comment about, Christian-based counseling kind of thing, that you'd have to judge and figure that out. Yeah. Yes. 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 So a student of mine, transgender student who was seeing a counselor for issues not related to sexual orientation at all, or gender identity at all. But their waiting room was filled with very conservative literature. So she would sit in the waiting room and look at the literature, the magazines and whatever that was out there, and realize that this counselor that she was about to go and see disagreed with her in her gender identity. And then when she went into the counselor's office to work with the counselor, they had crosses all over the wall, and it was I don't know if she quite used this word, but it was oppressive to her that clearly, without ever saying anything, just by virtue of the literature she had in the waiting room and the decor in her office, that this was a very Christian person who was espousing their Christianity silently and yet very effectively. And so this client had to be very, very careful to make sure that she didn't talk about anything that was going to be against that counselor's views. But it makes you kind of think, how do we decorate our offices, and to make sure that we decorate our offices and have literature in our waiting room that's going to be open and accepting, rather than espousing some sort of a worldview, imposing it in a passive sort of way. Yeah. Right.
But the person was not in agreement. How do you make that? Is it okay at any point for the counselor to do it if it becomes that?
I would say if the client, what we tell our students is, you can talk about God and religion in a session, that's not a problem, but the client needs to be the one that brings it up. And you always need to be client-centered. So if the client wants to bring up some sort of faith-related issue, it's perfectly fine to talk about that with the client, as long as you're not getting into some sort of a debate with the client about the rightness, wrongness of their religious worldview. So, sure, but there's a flip side to this. If the client's really comfortable with it and the counselor isn't, that can be a problem too. And there's always an issue of client-counselor fit. And this can be one of those areas where the client-counselor fit may not necessarily be very beneficial. Yeah. So another lawsuit. Keaton sued Augusta State University because she would not comply with a remediation plan aimed at getting her to accept counseling LGBT clients. And the judge had a beautiful response to this. And so this is what the judge wrote. Keaton's conflation of personal and professional values, or at least her difficulty in discerning the difference, appears to have been rooted in her opinion that the immorality of homosexual relations is a matter of objective and absolute moral truth. The policies which govern the ethical conduct of counselors, however, with their focus on client welfare and self-determination, make clear that the counselor's professional environs are not intended to be a crucible for counselors to test metaphysical or moral propositions. Plato's Academy or a seminary, the counselor program is not. That Keaton's opinions were couched in absolute or ontological terms does not give her constitutional license to make it otherwise. One conspicuous and abiding theme of the American story is that individuals like Jennifer Keaton are free to choose their own spiritual path and need brook no government trespass thereon. The Constitution guarantees that the heart may pulse to meters of its own design, deaf to public cadence, his words, not mine. But when affairs of the conscience ripen into action, either speech or conduct, government is granted leave to regulate in behalf of certain public interests, including education and professional fitness. So in other words, the judge sided with the ethical code and said, because it's the benefit of client welfare, the person, they ruled against Jennifer Keaton. Yeah, yeah. And the courts have historically been in favor of ethical codes. But legislatures like Michigan, Arizona, and Nebraska, and I think others, on the other hand, go, well, we'll just make it a law that they don't have to do that. And we're not even going to get into the whole conversion therapy issue that some states have tried to also pass that to allow that sort of a thing. Because evidence-based, not religion-based, that's very harmful. And there's lots of evidence for that. But people make laws, and then ACA, CRCC, and CRE, and various professional organizations then have to go lobby those state legislatures not to pass those laws, because it restricts our ethical behavior for working with that clientele. So we always have to have an ethical decision-making model. I took this one from Dr. Killam. An ethical legal decision-making model, because this ethics bleeds over into legal issues. So we have to determine if the legal ethical issue needs to be addressed. What are the contextual issues, culture, personal bias? Then figure out an ethical legal course of action, and then implement the action plan. It's a very simple ethics code, but I've got some scenarios on here. So scenario number one, what are we doing? Yeah. Chris volunteers for a charity that provides counseling in schools and is in a placement in a large inner-city secondary school. As an out lesbian, she has felt uncomfortable to witness the level of homophobic abuse among the children, which, as far as she can tell, goes largely unchallenged by staff. Shazia, a 13-year-old child from a Somali family, has been referred to the service because of concern about her poor attainment. She is shy and withdrawn and has been bullied by other children for being gay because she wears trousers and likes to play football. Shazia does not feel able to talk to her parents about how she feels and has disclosed to Chris that she has been cutting herself to manage her emotions. She has also opened up to Chris about being attracted to girls and her fear that her family will reject her if they find out, due to strong cultural and religious convictions that label homosexuality an abomination. Chris and Shazia have formed a strong alliance. Shazia admires Chris and sees her as a strong, independent woman. Chris feels a desire to protect Shazia and has discussed in supervision the possibility that it might be empowering for Shazia if Chris were to disclose her own sexuality in the work. The charity providing the counseling service has clear guidelines against therapist self-disclosure. Chris's supervisor has cautioned her not to do so. In session 5, Shazia asks Chris directly if she's a lesbian. What should Chris do? Should she come out to Shazia or not?
I think it's like ask why it's appropriate to know
So not come out? Avoid the question?
I'm not, yeah, avoid it.
Avoid the question? Any other thoughts? Yeah. Yeah. Right.
understand something, or is it because, oh, it's good, finally, more people are also gay or lesbian, and it's nice to share this, and it feels like it's doing something for them more than
Right.
us.
Yes. Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah. So, is it going to feel good to Chris to be able to come out to Shazia? Is she meeting Chris's needs at that point rather than Shazia's needs? That's something you got to wrestle with. Yeah. There's another part of this too, though, that we need to pay attention to. The agency, she's a volunteer, but she's still working for an agency. So even though she's not getting paid, she's under the auspices of an agency. And the agency says, just don't do it. So personally, she may feel that this would be very helpful. Maybe she can even give some professional, rational reasons on why this would be helpful for Shazia, for her to answer the question truthfully and say that she is a lesbian. However, the agency says you can't. And so there can be a conflict between what you might think is therapeutically helpful versus what the agency says you can't do. So this is one of those moral questions that we're sometimes faced with. Is it important is it okay to break the rules of your agency because it's going to be good for your client? And what's that going to do to, you certainly can do that, but what's that going to do to your relationship with Shazia? So it's kind of you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, and the client initiated it. And so how do I handle that situation? It could be difficult, right? So I took this from an article, and they posed the scenario, and then they asked people to submit how they would handle it, and there was like 4 different responses to it, and 3 of them said no, you don't disclose, and they all had different reasons about why you shouldn't. Some of the reasons were you can't violate your agency's rules. Some of the issues were it's not going to help the client, or it's meeting Chris's needs rather than the client needs. And only one out of the 4 said, yeah, the bigger issue here is it's going to be beneficial for the client. But 3 out of 4 said, no, you can't do it. It's speculative. Yes. Yeah, and you get into things here like transference and countertransference, and it's a very, very sticky kind of thing to get into. Some of the responses were to say something along the lines of, Shazia, before I answer that question, I need to talk to my supervisor, kind of a thing. And again, put yourself in the place of a 13-year-old girl who's trying to find role models, and they come across a counselor who they think is a strong role model, and then they ask this really important question that's going to make a real difference in their life when they ask it. At 13, everything's important at 13. We all kind of remember that. And then the counselor's response, this person who you look up to, says, let me get back to you on that. How are you going to feel if you're at 13 when your counselor's like, I'll tell you that next week? That's all right. That's a good point. Yeah. Yeah.
Already being prepared with resources, like I know this really great support group already of these great people that you could go to, and maybe I don't know.
No, that's a good point. You have the resources available, but you're still avoiding the question from Shazia. Before I answer that, Shazia, here, read these pamphlets, kind of a thing, right? So I was wrestling with this. If I tried to put myself in Chris's shoes, which is kind of difficult, I think I would want to disclose. For me, I think that would be helpful. But like you said, Bob, do we know it's going to be helpful? What are the consequences down the road if I go ahead and answer that question? So I found this in Carl Rogers. This is really cool. This is also from Moffat. Although we do not know what religious beliefs Carl Rogers held or whether he experienced any values conflict when counseling Gloria. Do we all remember Gloria? The famous tapes? Maybe not. I don't think that they show them anymore. Gloria revealed her participation in casual sexual relationships after her divorce. Her counselor could have experienced a value conflict in this situation. In a particularly tender point in the session, Gloria expressed feeling guilty about engaging in these sexual relationships and guilty for lying to her daughter about it. When Gloria directly asked Carl Rogers what she should do, she was clearly vulnerable to an imposition of his values. It's kind of like maybe Chris and Shazia. Consider how the following possible responses, none of which Carl Rogers actually made, could have affected this. So, clients in session with Carl Rogers, talks about being somewhat promiscuous. Carl Rogers has an opportunity here to impose a worldview. This is what he didn't say, because this would be really awkward. This is your life, Gloria, and you can do as you like, but I believe sex outside of marriage is a sin. How's that going to help Gloria? Not much. Your sexual relationships aren't something I am comfortable discussing with you. What else would you like to talk about? Not helpful. I know a great counselor across town who specializes in these issues, and I would like to refer you. Not helpful. Our hope is that a potential harm that could befall Gloria as a result of such responses is clearly evident. Already feeling guilty, Gloria is especially vulnerable to signs of disapproval or rejection. Carl Rogers' actual response offered neither. Additionally, and very importantly, his response did not communicate acceptance. Instead, he acknowledged hearing Gloria's plea for advice about what to do and communicated, although he wished he could tell her what she should do, this was a personal decision that only she could make. So when Carl Rogers had a similar kind of thing, it was put it back on the client not to take the bait for judgment, one way or the other, because it has to be a client-focused kind of an issue, not a personal-focused kind of an issue. But clients walk us into these kind of traps fairly regularly. What should I do? And we have to be very aware to go, especially in rehab counseling with vocational issues and stuff like that, tell me what to do. Tell me what job I'm supposed to do, career and decision from Dr. Weber. And we have to be very, very careful that the clients are making those choices rather than we are. But, you know, you're really busy in the agency, the state federal agency, and you got tons of clients, you got 150 caseload. It's a whole lot easier to just go, this is what you need to do. And I've seen that. The reason I became a professor was because I worked with too many counselors that would behave like that and tell clients this is what you need to do and just take away those choices. And so, yeah, it's a lot harder to figure out how to help the client to make the choice they need to make, but it saves a lot of time when you do it. But you want to do good work, right work, or you want to be fast and efficient and unethical? That becomes one of the choices that we have to make. And so, just like we wouldn't make that choice for people because we wouldn't want to judge, or we wouldn't want to judge what their choices are, you know, my rule was I'm going to go ahead and let a client fail one time, and then, so the deal I always made is you get one chance at this, and if it doesn't work, then we're going to do it my way. So, you know, we would negotiate that. But that was the way of trying to avoid that trap. Here, in a situation like this, it's the same kind of thing. It's like, you need to figure this out, but I need to figure out a way to maintain this therapeutic alliance with you and still adhere to my ethical code and competencies. Make sense? This one I took from Dr. Killam. I don't know if this was from an old PowerPoint, so I don't know if we've done this one or not. But it kind of fits what we're talking about. The rehabilitation counselor, Mandy, practices in a rural East Texas setting. She receives a referral from the local community mental health clinic. The client, Carla, is 53 years of age, male and transgender. His legal name is Carl, but he is going by Carla and in the process of transitioning and wants to be referred to as she and is recently divorced. The divorce was a traumatic small-town divorce. The diagnosis was depression, and Carla has been hospitalized a number of times. In female clothing, it is obvious that she is male. The counselor's approach has been to encourage Carla to dress as a male when going to job interviews and when employed. See any problems yet? Such as? Can you see from the counselor's perspective, I want to help you, and the way to help you is you need to dress this way when you go for interviews. And I could easily see a counselor rationalizing that as offering good and helpful job seeking, job finding, job securing tips, right? Part of my job as a rehab counselor is to help you get a job. I'm just trying to help you get a job.
I think that scenario is really challenging because as I'm reading it, I'm thinking about the counsel that I give with like a client with autism, and I'm not intending to, but we're kind of being forcing social rules on somebody that doesn't operate by those rules, but we're saying, yeah, but the employer approaches yourself as this rule. So when you're in an interview, you just speak correctly and have good eye contact and things that are totally against their nature.
Right.
How they look on.
Right. And so where do we draw the line between clients' right for self-expression and being who they are versus you need to change who you are in order to be accepted by society?
Does this imply that there has been a contract, so to speak, established between the counselor and the client in the sense of whether he's trying to get done? Because if it's job seeking,
Right.
then I think it, deal with the reality of how employers are going to react and that sort of thing. But if it's how to deal with their sexuality and how they're viewing the world, that'd be a different sort of context, I think.
I think if I would try and put myself in this situation, I think I would say something along the lines of, you can dress however you like, but you need to understand your choices are yours. But kind of like I was saying before, you need to understand the consequences of your choices. So I'm not going to tell you how to dress, but this might be some consequences for how you dress. And so you might want to consider, changing in order to secure a job. And just saying that out loud, I feel a little crappy. Even in just this scenario, just saying that makes me feel like, oh God, that's a conversation I don't want to have. Because I'm just by saying that, I'm kind of saying you're making some bad choices here, don't do it. Yeah. Sorry. Right. 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 Sure. Yeah. That's a way to think of it, yeah. That's a nice reframing, yeah. Think of it as a uniform. Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. As long as, it's kind of like informed consent. You just give the people all the information you can give them, and then client autonomy again. You let the client make the choices that they make with the understanding that, there are going to be some consequences, good and or bad, to those choices. Yeah. However he wants. Yeah. Just like anybody looking for any job, we have to find a place that's going to fit, where we fit in some way, shape, or form, or else we don't stay at that job. We either move on or we get let go from that job. So, Dr. Weber and career stuff, I know there's a huge issue is the whole person-employer fit. And so, like your clients, like if they don't accept me as who I am, then I don't want to work for them anyway, which is fine, with the understanding you might be limiting your choices, your options. Yeah. Neck tattoos, like really? Yeah. Dr. Weber, you had your hand up.
Yeah, also, I think from a rehab counselor standpoint, identifying friendly employers, the receptive employers.
Yes.
For instance, in Nacogdoches, we were working with a transgender client, and Lone Star Feed and Tractor Supply were not so open. But Starbucks and the call centers were.
Yeah.
Yeah, so.
Yeah. Yeah. The feed store, yeah, I could see how that might not be the good fit. Right. Yeah. So is it okay for you as the counselor to call the employer beforehand and say, Carl's coming in, but she might be Carla? Is it okay for you to do that? No. No. You can't be outing your client like that. I just want you to know that she might be wearing a dress, she might not. She might be wearing a suit. No, that we should not do that. Yeah, that would be really bad. So there's actually more to this little story here. The client objects, stating that's not who she is. Mandy has also been encouraging Carla to move to a larger city. Again, Carla objects, stating that it means breaking the bond with her children. When the issue of children are brought up, the counselor suggests that Carla should only have limited supervised visits with the children. This is getting a lot worse, isn't it? The counselor even tells Carla that her ex-wife, who was filed for full custody, should get the children. Mandy even indicates that if asked, she would testify on behalf of the wife receiving full custody. Carla is clearly very frustrated with Mandy. So how many ethical issues do we have here? This thing has gone completely off the rails at this point. It's like every sentence is another ethical problem here. It just keeps getting worse. Um, it's partly a function of the screen. We can get you a copy of it.
Better?
I did not know that. I learned something. Okay, so we're not going to spend time on all the ethical issues because I think they're fairly evident. What recourse does Carla have at this point? Good reporter. Contact the board. Yeah. Yeah, for mistreatment. Yeah. This is a counselor who is clearly imposing some worldviews that are at odds with their client, to the point of being what's the word? Maltreatment, malpractice. The counselor will be? Yes. The counselor needs some career guidance and a new job. Yes. Yes. Who we got here? So it would not be right for me to come up here and say that ethically you need to be getting some training into working with LGBTQ clients and not offer you some possibility, some options for learning some of the competencies related to working with those clients. And so Lindsay Milner, who I mentioned earlier, gave me the article, and I forgot to bring it with me, that lists all of the competencies, which are way too many for me to bring here today, but I did bring a sample. And in reading through the competencies, ethically, I don't think I can leave without presenting you some competencies. However, this is my caveat. This is in no way a substitute for getting specific training and working with this clientele. So just because we're talking some of the competencies doesn't necessarily mean that this is the training that you need or should get. And I'll just start in out of order a little bit with E, because it starts with A, but I put this one first because we need to use an ethical decision-making model that takes into consideration the needs and concerns of the individual when facing an ethical dilemma. We want to use a collaborative approach with individuals to work through the ethical dilemmas. And we want to consult supervisors and colleagues when their personal values conflict with the counselor's professional obligations related to LGBTQ, in this case, individuals about creating a course of action. Seek consultation and supervision from an individual who has knowledge and awareness, and use language and techniques in intervention that affirm, accept, and support the autonomy of intersecting identities and communities for LGBTQ individuals. Because this is straight out of the ethics portion again. It's find a decision-making model, get the supervision that you need, so don't be wading into territory that you're not necessarily knowledgeable about, and without finding somebody to help you figure out how to handle all of that stuff. Again, assist, and for career and lifestyle development, assist LGBTQ individuals in making career choices that facilitate both identity acceptance and job satisfaction. So this is kind of the scenario we were just talking about with the client who some days wears a dress and some days wears a suit, and helping them figure out, find the right career, right job fit that's going to accommodate them so that they don't have to deny who they are, you know. To some extent, pretty much all of our employers, unless you work for yourself, we have to subsume some of our identity in order to keep our job. However, at what point does that become oppressive versus just a standard kind of thing that I don't necessarily have to deny who I am, but I kind of have to maybe tone down who I am because I'm at work versus not at work. So helping clients find the right fit. Understand how career theories may not take into account the unique barriers and challenges that LGBTQ individuals face in their career paths, and integrate the use of career theories in ways that are affirming of the needs of these individuals. So career theories and how do these fit for these clientele? Again, there's a lot of parallels I see between that and people working with people with disabilities. that we need to figure out how the theories fit for different sets of clientele. Use of particular career theories may not have been normed for LGBTQ individuals. Interventions based on such theory need to be assessed for their efficacy. So we can't just plug and play career theories. We need to always figure out how career theories fit or not for our clientele. Understand how systemic and institutionalized oppression against these individuals may adversely affect career performance and or result in negative evaluation of job performance, and thus may limit career options, resulting in underemployment, less access to financial resources, overrepresentation and underrepresentation in certain careers. Substitute people with disabilities, pretty much the same issue. Not a lot of difference. So at the beginning, human growth and development, understand biological, familial, cultural, socioeconomic, psychosocial factors influence the course of development in gender identity expressions. Affirm LGBTQ individuals have the potential to integrate their affectional orientations and gender identity into fully functioning and emotionally healthy lives and relationships. So be affirming of them and their identity and their expressions in order to be helpful to them. Be aware of the effects of internalized homophobia, biphobia, transphobia may have on individuals and their mental health. Again, just like we want to be careful with people with disabilities about their internalized depression. I'm not worthwhile because everybody in my society has been telling me I'm not worthwhile. We always want to work against that with people with disabilities. Similar issue here for a different set of clientele. Notice developmental periods throughout the lifespan, youth, adolescence, young adults, middle adults, older adults, may affect the concerns of LGBTQ clients present in counseling. One of the issues for Chris and Shazia was in those responses I was telling you about. In at least one of those responses, it pointed out that she's 13. And at the age of 13, early teens, is this a phase? Is this curiosity? You know, we want to take in some developmental aspects here before, and have some consideration of that before we start answering Shazia's question about whether whether Mandy was a lesbian, or was it Mandy? Chris was a lesbian or not. It's different coming from a 13-year-old than it would be from a 30-year-old, right? How so? Like, how do we account for lifespan and human development if the question is posed by a 30-year-old versus Shazia, a 13-year-old? Are you more or less comfortable in acknowledging and answering for a 30-year-old versus 13? Yes. And there are some 30-year-olds who are 13. Yes.
So I just don't think that age number can be a factor. It has to be looking at how
Sure.
they are.
But if we're going to assume the 30-year-old is an actual mature 30-year-old and the 13-year-old is an actual, for lack of a better term, immature 13-year-old. Right. Would you agree that it's easier to influence, your influence might be stronger with a 13-year-old versus a 30-year-old? Right? Yeah. And so one of the self-reflecting things that we would hopefully be able to take into account is, how is my response going to affect a 13-year-old versus if Shazia was 30? You know, I'm probably going to be a little more careful with a 13-year-old who's still developing and still figuring a lot of things out versus somebody who, at 30, I'm going to make the assumption here, has probably got a lot of things already figured out. At least more so than at 13. So yeah, you do have to definitely assess the individual, but the person's age and level of maturity related to that age can be one of those variables that you would consider, I would think. You know, I'm going to work differently with an 18-year-old than I am with somebody twice that age, somebody at 36. Yeah.
Maybe some of you have yet to watch, but there's also a documentary, 2 years old, called Growing Up Gay. It's about someone who has a transgender child, and they notice when they were 2, their son was very intimate with their daughter. It's actually a really good story. I suggest that some of you watch that documentary. It might help.
Growing Up Gay?
Growing up okay.
Can we Google that? Can we find that on the internet somehow and see it?
Yeah.
So what's the title? I'm sorry.
I've watched it on Netflix.
What's the title again?
Growing up
Boy?
Coy.
Coy? C-O-I? Coy? Okay. How old is it?
I want to say maybe 7 or 8 years ago.
Okay. I'm not aware of it. It might be interesting to find, yeah. Social and cultural diversity. Be aware of current issues, struggles, victories for that community, such as marriage equality, don't ask, don't tell, hate crimes legislation, suicides related to anti-LGBT bullying, as well as current events within the profession, students, practitioner refusing services to individuals, again, which is the whole point of why I brought this topic up in the first place, is to just bring awareness to the situation that may not have been there before. Acknowledge and affirm identities as determined by the individual, including preferred labels, reference terms for partners, and level of outness. So one of the questions that people get asked these days is, what are your pronouns? So I went to Disability Pride Festival up in Madison, Wisconsin last summer, and because I wanted to see how it was, and it's a very open event, and I introduced myself to the woman who looked like in charge, and it was the first time I've ever been asked. She goes, "Oh, nice to meet you. What are your pronouns?" And I was kind of like, nobody's ever asked me this question before. Well, if you have gender identity issues, you may want to be called she rather than he. And sometimes they use they because it's gender neutral. And so there's a lot now of people asking in this community, like, what pronouns do you prefer? So how should I refer to you? Yeah. Yeah. So it took me for a second, because I'd read about this, but I'd never been asked it before. And so I was kind of like, I'm a he. And it felt really strange to say that, but it is a legitimate question. It really is. You know, I want to refer to you in the way that you want to be referred to. And so it's a very respectful kind of question, but it's new, you know. One other quick thing, and part of the reason I wanted to do this is that historically, why I think this is so important is historically, one of the very first communities that was open and accepting of people with disabilities was the LGBTQ community. African Americans, for civil rights, were always very open to people with disabilities. But for actual expression of yourself and who you are and personal identity, the LGBT community has been with people with disabilities for a very, very long time. And the whole disability pride movement is somewhat borrowed from the gay pride movement. And they're very close cousins within the community, because people with disabilities, with an integrated disability identity, have to understand themselves as they're somewhat different from the mainstream able-bodied society. And in that sense, it's similar, not the same, but similar to LGBTQ community in how they differ from mainstream society, and how identity is so important in truly expressing who and what you are can be really crucial to your own mental health. And so I think it's really, really important we give props to the LGBT community for helping the disability community come to realization about who they are and expressing of themselves in a prideful sort of way. You know, and as counselors, we need to be reciprocal in making sure that we treat any kind of minority, in this case LGBT community, in a respectful, open, and affirming way, because that's part of our jobs. Not just, and it's not just the ethics of it, it's part of the profession. So, questions, comments?
I know I've been hearing people say, like, where do people go and get training? I know here in Houston, there's a new provider over in the Montrose area. His name is Justice Smith.
Oh, okay.
A place called Citizen, where he goes around and does these trainings for different organizations. And then there's also a book that I've referred to parents before, and it's called, I think it's called Mom, I'm Gay. And the actual book is written by a woman who is a pastor,
Really?
who had to learn to understand and accept their child when they came out. And I think it's a good resource for people who are having issues related to their religion and faith, but as when people really accept.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. Thank you. Yeah, historically, another similarity, historically, religion and people with disabilities have not gotten along very well, and the same with the LGBT community, have typically not always gotten along very well. Some of that's changing with modern views, for sure, but in the long sweep of history, people with disabilities and religion have not gotten along very well. I've been on numerous occasions offered to be cured and laying on of hands and things like that, which is extremely awkward position to be in when somebody automatically judges you as being wrong and in need of fixing and wanting to cure you via spiritual means. Yeah. I have, really, honest to God. Honest to God, yeah. Do you have your hand? Yeah, I think what we're going to do, I think we put them on the TRA website. Is that probably the easiest way to do that? Right, Bob?
I think so.
Yeah, yeah,
Not
yeah.
yet,
But we can get them up there. Yeah, like I can email this to you later today.
Kendra, email it to Kendra at the
Okay.
Folks, also, we're recording all the sessions, in audio and slides, and we'll get them on the TRA website. It takes us a little while to edit them, but we'll get,
So check the website in like what, a week?
give us 2 weeks.
2 weeks? Okay. But we can get the PowerPoints up quicker.
PowerPoint.
We can get those up pretty quick. Yeah. I don't know if I have Kendra's email, but
I'll get it for you.
okay. Anything else? That's a fantastic idea. That's a fantastic idea. We should definitely do that. Yeah. Yeah. Make a note of that, Dr. Weber. Lindsay Milner next year to present on this topic,
Absolutely.
so that we can have some training on it.
You bet.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Thank you.
Very good, guys. We're going to adjourn for lunch. And he has the certificates for this session.
She wanted to show you.
Growing Up Coy.
Yeah, that's the movie. And it's about that daughter.